Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the Japanese Studies and Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project series. My name is Harrison Watson, a co-coordinator of this project, along with Rachel Willis, Sophie Haswell, and Professor Reginald Jackson. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to briefly explain the format of this event and give some announcements. Your microphones and cameras have been disabled. We invite you to submit questions during the lecture through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and our moderator will try to get through as many of them as possible after Dr. Ching's presentation. Next Thursday, May 20th, we'll be welcoming Professor Amoria Shimabuku at noon to give a talk entitled Kaleidoscopic Vision, Okinawa Amidst Competing Trans-Pacific Politics. The following Thursday, May 27th, we'll have Professor Zelida Rivas giving a talk at noon as well. You can find the registration links for both events, as well as the full webinar schedule on our website. We'd also like to announce that the application for our graduate student workshop slated for June 18th, entitled Developing Anti-Racist Syllabi for Studies of Japanese Culture, is taking applications. The workshop will be open to both undergraduate and graduate level applicants. The workshop application will close on May 21st. The Japanese Studies Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project, which centers BIPOC graduate students and faculty as key partners and co-organizers of this intellectual enterprise, is designed to develop a forum for discussing and promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the field of Japanese studies. The project's aim is to enhance awareness and quality of teaching related to DEI issues within Japanese studies, with an explicit emphasis on anti-racist pedagogy as the basis for public-facing humanities research and professional development for graduate students. It's my pleasure to introduce Leo Ching, Professor of East Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University. Professor Ching holds a bachelor's from Occidental College, master's from UCLA, and PhD from UC San Diego. Professor Ching's research focuses on colonial discourse studies, post-colonial theory, Japanese mass culture, and theories of globalization and regionalism. His published work includes Becoming Japanese, Colonial Taiwan and the Politics of Identity Formation, and Anti-Japan, the Politics of Sentiment in Post-Colonial East Asia. Professor Ching has also published articles on Boundaries 2, Positions, and Public Culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leo Ching, whose talk is entitled Contrapuntal Imaginations, Reading Empires in an Undergraduate Japanese Studies Class.
Thank you, Harrison. I'd like to thank Professor Jackson for the kind invitation, but also Rachel, Sophie, and Harrison for the coordination. I hope everyone is doing well, staying healthy, and looking forward to the weekend. So thank you for coming. So I have organized my presentation today, taking the pedagogy part literally. I'm actually going to be sharing with you some of the stuff that I actually do in undergraduate class here at Duke. So if there's anything that you would like me to send you, like the video clips that I use or any other information, please feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to share. Okay, so let me just start sharing my screen. Okay. So I assume you can see my presentation. All right. So let me just quickly begin with this concept that Edward Said has elaborated in his 1993 book, Culture and Imperialism, something called Contrapuntal Reading, or you might find sometimes it's called Contrapuntal Analysis. So basically, contrapuntal reading is a method of analyzing colonial and post-colonial literature that reads the narratives of colonizers alongside those of the colonized, examining opposite and intertwined histories. And as is well known, Edward Said is also a very prolific pianist. So obviously, he borrowed the idea of contrapuntal from music. I personally do not play any instrument, so my understanding is that contrapuntal basically means this kind of counterpoint in the harmonies that are both interdependent but also dependent. So I sort of sketch out three sort of maybe larger ways in which how contrapuntal reading works in not just literature but any kind of text. One is the marginal presence of empire in metropolitan text. And Said actually spends a lot of time in the book talking about Mansfield Park and the kind of mentioning the insinuation of Antigua, the sugar plantation in the Caribbean, but without much elaboration. So he asked us to read, quote, with an effort to draw out, extend, give emphasis and voice to what is silent or marginally present, end of quote. And this is where he talks about the importance of Antigua and the sugar plantation that sustained the kind of livelihood of the kind of bourgeoisie in London at the time. He also sort of used contrapuntal to think about asymmetrical colonial relationship, how different texts explain or elaborate on a similar historical event. And here he talks about the different readings of Napoleon invasion of Egypt, is to expose the contrast in imperial experience for two sides of the same conflict. Last but not least, he also expand contrapuntal reading to something I'm calling associative reading, text that exists in different space and time to explore imperial conjunctures. So in my sort of presentation today, I will actually spend more time thinking contrapuntal as sort of between imperial text. In other words, how different empires could be read contrapuntally and how that will enable us to understand the larger, to have a fuller picture of empire. So since this is a class, so I have some learning objectives for everyone. So hopefully after the presentation, you're able to analyze imperial relations between text, examine intertwined histories. You'll be able to comprehend the competition and complicity between empires, and I'll be focusing more on complicity. Third, demonstrate traces of empire in the post-colonial present. And this is quite important for Said. In contrapuntal analysis, he basically argues that there's a continuity between the colonial empire and our post-colonial present. Last but not least, hopefully after this presentation, we're able to apprehend popular culture as a site of ideological contestation. Okay. I will basically focus on two case studies. First one is I want to contrapuntally read modernization theory and the so-called model minority myth. And secondly, I want to, and this is take off my, a chapter from my book, Anti-Japan book. Again, reading contrapuntally between Godzilla, the Japanese film, and Godzilla, the American version of Godzilla. And if we have time, I would want to also pivot to what I call Asian heroes. And I have a piece in PMLA that actually address the Asian side of these, what I'm calling TransImperial characters. All right, so why don't I begin with the first case, modernization theory and model minority discourse. So as well known, modernization theory actually emerged in the 1950s and in the 60s, especially in sociology, but in many different fields, as a universal discourse on the trajectory of social transformation, especially the discourse of development and progress. I call this the temporal dimension. In other words, this is there's a certain kind of developmentalism that's built into the discourse of modernization. The second is that these, what I'm calling the spatial dimension, in which the success of Western Europe and North America are deemed as the center of this modernization discourse. The third is it is a liberal democratic capitalism constituted as the telos of history against the ideological claims of the Soviet Union. So this puts us right in the Cold War context. And this is also important in terms of this sense of telos, this kind of linear history. And J.M. Blott, in his book, The Colonizer's Model of the World, have talked about this idea of diffusionism in imperialism, how imperialist discourse is based on this rhetoric of diffusion, that the center of Eurocentrism begins in Western Europe, that gradually diffuses to the world, creating what he calls the colonizer's model of the world. And last but not least, modernization theory is a response to the decolonization process as anti-imperialist and non-racist alternative to the older ideologies of empire. So how is modernization theory work in the context of Japan? So first, in the post-war and high-growth Japan is seen as a showcase or an example for the theory and model of development for others to follow. In the 1970s, there's this notion, this model called the flying geese, where Japan leads the pack of Southeast Asian countries, flying in a formation as long that these so-called developing countries, as long they follow the model set up by the Japanese, they can also achieve democracy, economic liberalization, and so on and so forth. And between 1953 and 1966, the Ford Foundation invested $270 million into 34 American universities to build up area and language study programs. I'm pretty sure Michigan was probably one of the 34 institutions. And this is, again, just to reiterate the complicity of our own discipline in terms of this modernization theory. So modernization theory is directed against Marxist conception of history in 1960s unpopular protests and political of the Japanese left. It is a broader anti-communist East Asia policy of American policy. So Western universalism and Japanese particularism. So the Marxist interpretation of Japanese history based on certain kind of historical materialism, such as feudal remnants, traditional structures, and complete transformation are now rendered as cultural traditions that are actually conducive to modernization and economic growth. And we see a very similar sort of repetition here in the interpretation of the economic success of China today. So for example, Confucianism that once was deemed as the impediment to modernization is now reinterpreted as something that actually enabled a rapid development in mainland China, right? So there is this kind of Western universal model, but there's some kind of particular Chinese, Japanese cultural embeddedness that enabled the economic growth. Another sort of very important element of the modernization theory is this idea of the internalist approach, that things are actually emanated from within, so disregard certain kind of structure from the outside or external impetus. And I'll come to this later. And then speed is seen as the most important factor in quote unquote measuring modernization. And if you can see in the background, I have three sort of figures. And I've been sort of very fascinated by this idea of 3 minutes. So at the lower bottom on the right side, you have this QP, Sanbun Cooking Group. It's a TV program that is based on this idea of 3-minute cooking, that you can cook a meal in 3 minutes. And then this was around 1962. And then in 1966, we have the first Ultraman, this superhero on television. And as you may know, Ultraman can only stay on the Earth for 3 minutes. In other words, he needs to defeat the monsters all within 3 minutes. And then on the right upper side, you see the famous cup noodles, which of course only requires three minutes to cook to be consumed. So I'm not sure how to theorize this, but at least there's a certain kind of convergence between the 60s and early 70s, this idea of speed, right, and 3 minutes. And of course, in 1964, we have the Shinkansen in conjunction with the Tokyo Olympics, which of course reinforces the idea of speed. Okay, now let me sort of pivot to the model minority myth. So model minority discourse emerged in the wake of the US Department of Labor's 1965, the Moynihan Report, which examined the causes and state to racial condition and disparities in the United States, especially in the amongst what they called the Negro family. So the response to the report actually dramatically shifted the focus, and blame for racial inequalities shift from the systemic racism to actually the honors of Black families and their disintegration as cause for poverty, something that I think we are very, very familiar with it today as well. So, but however here, the Black failures is juxtaposed with Asian success that's minimize structural racism and white supremacy. Again, I think we see this recurring discourse today as well. So the important article that in a way propelled this notion of the modern minority comes from William Peterson in his 1966 New York Times op-ed called Success Story, Japanese American Style, where he argues that Asians as industrious and rule-abiding in contrast to the Black communities, which are considered lazy, sort of not initiating their own kind of changing their the career in terms of benefiting themselves and the community. So modernization theory and modern minority myth are usually read separately. So the contrapuntal will sort of force us to read them along the same kind of American and imperial model. So if we put them together, you look something like this, right? So use empire abroad and at home. I call them the kind of ideological containment. So on the left-hand side, you have American imperialism outside of the United States, which is the externalization of American empire, modernization theory, and then the internal sort of modern minority myth. And as you can tell, right, I mean, there's the theory versus the myth, okay? And I'll come to that shortly. So here, under modernization theory, we have Japan as a showcase for others to emulate, the flying geese model, as I already mentioned. And within the United States, Asian or mostly Japanese American as model of exception from mostly Blacks. And then they share this notion of the internalist approach, right? The cultural embeddedness that enable certain kind of, on the one hand, economic takeoff, on the other hand, assimilation. And modernization theory, as I mentioned earlier, displaces Marxism and the questions of empire. And the modern minority myth also minimizes the historical discrimination against Asians from the Asian Exclusion Act to the Japanese internment during World War II. Actually, the internment camp is actually quite interesting because it's actually used as a way to demonstrate how the Japanese American, despite the political tragedy, was able to pull themselves up against all sort of difficulties and be able to be successful. So I see them both as operating in a similar liberal democratic apparatus, state apparatus. On the one hand, modernization theory is alternative to communism, whereas within the United States, is to argue that people of color can enjoy equality and social mobility as long as they buy into the notion of ethnic assimilation to the American version of success. So once we're able to see this contrapuntally, then we're in a better position to look at, to understand first the bifurcation of area studies and Asian American studies. As I said earlier, the difference between modernization theory and the modern minority myth, because in a way, area studies continues to be the handmaiden of American imperialism, especially during the Cold War anti-communism. Whereas Asian American studies, as many know, in 1960s, the term Asian American is adopted in a collaboration or in solidarity with Black movement. So it's very institutional founding is based on certain kind of anti-American racism within the US. However, at the time, Asian American studies is usually construed as being within the national framework, rather than speaking to a kind of what's developing now, what we call kind of trans-Pacific critical studies. And I mean, we can talk about the shifting disciplinarity of area studies or Asian studies and Asian American studies later if we have time. So by looking at them contrapuntally, we see how liberalism itself was actually quite important in constructing this idea of accommodation, the idea of diversity, acceptance, or something we call benign racism. But the critique of liberalism, as we saw with the complicity between internalist argument and the larger exclusion of structural understanding, is that essentialist sort of culturalism would not be able to mount a serious critique of liberalism. So in other words, because there's a complicity between universalism and particularism, and someone like Naoki Sakai from Cornell has done a tremendous job in articulating the kind of sort of configuration or interdependence between universalism and particularism. So that's the first case. So I'll shift to the second case, which I'm calling the imperial, trans-imperial characters, Godzilla and quote unquote Asian heroes in Cold War dimensionality. And I will try to sort of elaborate a little bit about, why I use these terms so we can have a working definition. So as people who have been to Japan or even, interest in Japanese popular culture, will know that characters are ubiquitous in Japan. And what you're looking here in this picture is actually what they call yuru kara. These are sort of characters that are representative of prefectures, cities, and so on and so forth. Any events basically can create characters. In the middle, you see this bear-looking character. His name is Kumamo, so it's from Kumamoto, or represents Kumamoto. So it's one of the actually more popular characters. But we see characters in anime and in fancy goods, in even in banks and so on and so forth. Even something like this, right? I mean, when you have the former Prime Minister Abe sort of cosplay as Super Mario in announcing Tokyo's ill-fated 2020, now 2021 Olympics. We can talk about that if you want as well later. So what do I mean by trans-imperial? Basically, the definition rests on two ideas. So one is the transition from one imperial formation to another. So from the earlier European empire, such as Dutch, the Spanish, to later the British and French, and of course, even later American and Japanese. So it delineates a certain kind of shift, right? Which also means the transfer of hegemonial power. And this obviously is very much connected with global capitalism and the world system theories. However, this transition or this kind of transfer does not mean that there's a radical break between the two. In fact, as I will demonstrate, there's this kind of complicity that between the new empire and the old ones. So there's also this overlapping of imperial powers, and Japan as quote unquote sub-imperial under American hegemony, for example. But trans-imperial is not only about transition, but also something called translation. So from one set of colonial knowledge to another, or we might call this the geopolitics of knowledge, since shifting the empire also necessitate a shifting of a geography, imagined geography, that is. So for example, as modernization theory has shown, so from civilizing mission in the older colonial model to modernization theory, from the puppet state of Manchukuo to American occupation of Japan. I understand Tak Fujitani was a speaker a few weeks ago. He actually has written about the Reischauer memo, where Reischauer, that is actually, was quite conscious of the using of in Manchuria of the last Ching imperial emperor as a puppet regime, and how that can be actually adopted to the American occupation of Japan. So there's a translation in terms of certain kind of imperial knowledge. And then, of course, in domestic Japan, the shift from discourse from imperialism to democracy, from militarism to pacifism. So this is what I mean by the trans-imperial. Character is can be understood as a figure, but what's important that it exists its own world, such as what I mentioned earlier about the Japanese cities and prefecture that exist within the world of Japanese locations. But then we can think about Disney, we can think about Hello Kitty, the Sanrio community. So they exist in their particular space. But they also have the potential to move beyond one media format to another, such as in Japan, this is known as media mix, in which something like Super Mario, who existed from, for example, a game from Nintendo to a movie, then to sort of goods to other type of media formats. Characters are also mediators. In other words, I'm borrowing here Nozawa Shunsuke's idea of the 2.5D. Nozawa argues that characters mediates between the real world, the 3D, and the virtual world, the 2D. So in between becomes the 2.5D. So the character actually shift between the real and the virtual in a very sort of interesting and embodied way. And I'm sure many of you have seen the New York Times article a few years ago about the otaku Japanese hugging a pillowcase with these beautiful women, young women's image on it. And I'm sure you also have heard another Japanese otaku man that actually married a image. So again, so the character mediates between reality and virtuality, rather than seeing reality and virtuality as completely separate. Character has the benefit of allowing us to understand the mediation between the two. So characters are also, simply representations, right? And lastly, and this is, I think, is more important for my own sort of understanding of how these characters function. They are embodiments of social anxiety, political unconscious, fantasy, and desire, especially in thinking about the issues of empire. So what I'm going to talk about here is, again, from a chapter of my anti-Japan book, looking at the shift from Godzilla, the Japanese film, 1954 film, to Godzilla, the American adaptation, or if you want to call it adaptation, in 1956. I insist on using Godzilla, the Japanese pronunciation, to talk about the Japanese version, and Godzilla to talk about the American adaptation, because I think they function very differently politically, but also I think the particular enunciation is important to understand what happens when one goes from Godzilla to Godzilla. All right, so let me just quickly, and I think this is pretty familiar to people who actually follow the franchise. So the historical significance of Godzilla. So it's Japan's return to the international stage before the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. So it's actually quite significant in the regard that Barack Krishna has called this Godzilla as a media event, right? It's from the very beginning, in a way, has set the stage for its own sort of the resurgence of Japan and its transnationality just a few years later. So this is also the first film free of American occupation censorship. And last but not least, it's the first film to generate a franchise. I think with the latest Netflix Godzilla versus Kong, we have maybe 35, 36 Godzilla related films. I think the last one I actually enjoyed was Shin Godzilla, the 2016. That actually had a very interesting, I think, take on the Japanese bureaucracy. But I usually tell students that it's not worth it actually watching anything after the 1954 original, which I still consider the most important and most interesting film of the Godzilla franchise. So the context of Godzilla. So part of, what's interesting about Godzilla is the particular special effects is called tokusatsu, which also inaugurated this idea of the kaiju genre. And there's, the entire books are written about tokusatsu, so it's impossible for me to kind of explain it fully here. But if you can imagine this as being a very analog, as opposed to like something like Pixar, whereas animation are done by computer technology and so forth. So this is actually very old school. So actually, so it creates some kind of aesthetics that it's not so seamless, right? That you can actually tell this is not real. And again, this is what I think is really interesting to think about the boundary between what is real, what is virtual, right? There's all this 2.5D space between the two. So it incorporated this King Kong inspired suitmation. So there's actually somebody sort of inside, the Godzilla suit. And this kind of miniaturization where houses, cars, and especially cities gets destroyed, right? But here, this actually, again, if we want to borrow the contrapuntal reading from Said, we also can see that there are these references to Japanese imperialism in the film. Not so explicit, right? So the Tsubaraya, actually, the producer of the Godzilla films, actually produced wartime propaganda for the Navy. The film was made possible because it was the initial project was rejected by Indonesian government for a film based on Indonesian independence and the remain of Japanese military in Dutch Southeast Asia that supposedly participated in Indonesian independence. So again, that's another sort of topic that I don't have time to go into. But the idea is that some Japanese actually were considered, sort of these anti-imperialist endeavors, and that assisted in the Indonesian independence from the Dutch. So, as many have argued that Godzilla is seen as a kind of anti-nuclear and anti-war film. But in this film, and Susan Napier has written about this, is that there is this kind of tacit sort of rewriting of history. So on the one hand, there's this particular aesthetics about Godzilla. There's this social catharsis, this venting of repressed fears and anger. And Susan Sontag have talked about the aesthetics of destruction, how films, allows us to enjoy certain destruction of buildings, of infrastructures, and so on and so forth, if not the earth itself. And yet there's also this idea of secure horror that Andrew Tudor introduces, right? That these horror will not last forever. There's always a way to conclude, right? In a safe way, in a fundamentally sort of non-traumatic way. To mediate between what the film is set out to demonstrate and how it is concluded. The film also demonizes American nuclear science, and it also creates this good sacrificial Japanese scientist, Serizawa, who saves the world. He also not just saves the world, but he also gives up his own arranged marriage to Eriko, the daughter of the professor, to enable romantic love between Eriko and Ogata. And it is actually quite interesting here that what's called tradition, right? So in a way, I talk a little bit about how in modernization theory, tradition or feudalism is not seen as an impediment to development, but rather enabled modernization. So in a way, we also see that here. That by sacrificing himself, Serizawa actually not just only saved the world, but he's giving up this tradition arranged marriage that enables certain kind of romantic love between Eriko and Ogata that is sort of construed as a kind of post-war Japanese sort of possibility. So, and last, it reimagines tragic wartime experience. And again, this goes back to the contrapuntal reading of how certain type of reference to imperialism are insinuated, but not elaborated. And here we see Serizawa in the picture with his eye patch, and we know that he sustained his injury during the war. And of course, there's also the music when Godzilla first approaches Tokyo, right? The doom, doom, doom sound, which again, for a lot of people have argued that it's reminiscent of the air raids during the war. So now let's shift to Godzilla, the 1956 American version. So American production had infinite wide latitude to do with the film, which reflect the unequal power relationship between Japan and occupied Japan and United States. And within the film, 30 minutes of explicit reference to Hiroshima and Nagasaki are understandably taken out. And last, the insertion of Raymond Burr as a reporter, Steve Martin, in exotic Asia. So the context of Godzilla. So emerging cinematic genre, so this is nothing new for American audience, right? This kind of nuclear giant sort of, it is already an existing genre, such as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, targeting young audience due to the unprecedented post-war economic boom and rise of teenagers as the category of consumers. And we see a kind of a similar importation of like, for example, martial arts films from Hong Kong, especially in 1970s, that again, to fill the need of African-American and Latino youth, sort of going to cinemas within the city, right, where the white flight to suburbs, right? So the cinema in the city needed sort of films to fill the demand. So martial arts films and so on and so forth are being brought in the 70s. So Godzilla also reflect the Cold War American and atomic age anxiety. And then this finally, and this is nothing specifically to the American reception, is that there's a gradual domestication and infantilization of a Godzilla in subsequent productions. And in other words, all the anxiety over nuclear bomb and so on and so forth, and in the Japanese case, the anxiety over war and so on and so forth, those are all basically taken away, and then the subsequent versions of Gojira and Godzilla simply become, monster versus technology, monsters versus human, and so on and so forth. So basically, I asked this question: how does a cultural icon from different production contexts, highly dubbed, edited, and transformed, become popular in both contexts? In short, what happens when Gojira becomes Godzilla, right? So the contrapuntal reading is what happens when if we read Gojira and Godzilla together. So what I'm going to show you is just two clips, right? One from the original Gojira, and then the second one from the American adaptation, 1956. And then I'll just play and I'll talk about this a little bit. So there's actually a lot we can probably, read these juxtaposition. But obviously one, sort of obvious reading is that there is this kind of feminization of the Asian aid to Raymond Burr's to Steve Martin, Raymond Burr's character, because they both follow the same pattern, right? Just like Emiko, the Asian aid falls down and then it gets picked up, and so there's definitely an easy kind of gender reading that one can do here. We can also, of course, do a racial reading here, because obviously Raymond Burr and the actor actually Frank Iwanaga is actually an Asian American actor, playing a Japanese, of course, helping Steve Martin navigate Asia and so on and so forth. So what I do is I read this book, and I mean this film, right? This sort of contrapuntal images as a way to understand what meaning can we derive from the shift from Godzilla to Godzilla. So this is what I basically would argue. That what I will argue is that the shift from Godzilla to Godzilla actually represent the shift from a Japanese sort of rewriting of history to a new version of American imperial presence. So I juxtapose the Steve Martin and then the Japanese aide figure with MacArthur and Hirohito in this very famous picture of the two. And what is important here is that I argue that there's a rehabilitation of Emperor Hirohito from basically a commander-in-chief on a white horse to a kind of a microbiologist. If we think about the three leaders of Axis powers, Mussolini was captured and then executed. Hitler was committed suicide. Hirohito is the only, right, that remain, that continue into a very long life. He didn't die until 1989. And a lot of people have argued that the rehabilitation of Hirohito also represented this defeat of Japan, in a way replaced the long and arduous process of decolonization that we see in most other imperial powers, whether it's the British or the French. So another way that I would like to argue the complicity between American imperialism and post-war Japanese democracy is this cenotaph in Hiroshima. So this is from the Hiroshima Peace Park, and within the center of the park is this cenotaph that I sort of enlarged the writing here. It says, "Yasaraka ni nemutte kudasai. Ayamachi wa kurikaeshima kara." In English, it translates as "rest in peace, for the error shall not be repeated." Because of the ambiguity in the Japanese language, the subject is never clear. So we don't know whose error were committed. Was the American for dropping the bomb, or Japanese for their military intervention, or not intervention, but military in Asia and other parts of the region? And also, as Lisa Yoriyama and others have written, the Koreans, during the nuclear bombing, over 45,000, if not more, Koreans were also killed during the bombing. And the memorial for the Korean victims were not allowed to be placed within the park until 1970s. So in the map, you'll see I circle where the Korean monument is. It's, as you can see, it's really sort of far out in the edge of the park. And if you don't actually look for it, oftentimes you're not gonna find it. And Yoriyama actually does a wonderful job sort of talk about the struggle of the Zainichi to have this monument included, and to this day, I think that the victims were not compensated because the fact that they were in post-war, they were considered non-Japanese. But we know during the colonial period, the reason why, first of all, these people were in Japan in the first place is to come to work as a laborer, right, for heavy industry. Hiroshima, as you know, it's a city very much involved in the wartime industrialization, Mitsubishi and so on and so forth, factories. So what can we then conclude by looking at the shift from Godzilla to Godzilla? And what can we, what are the takeaway from this contrapuntal reading? So I will argue that what it highlights is the complicity between US and Japan. So it together conspired to save Hirohito's life and the monarchy for Cold War politics. Japan promises not to repeat a crime that itself did not commit. Also, they obscure the questions of responsibility. Americans' crime in dropping the atomic bomb and Japan's war crime and colonialism in Asia. So through the kind of contrapuntal reading of Gojira and Godzilla, we're able to see how, oops, sorry, I was looking at the chat. We're able to see the complicity between the two. So the next part, actually, I wanted to sort of shift the analysis from US, Japan to Southeast Asia, basically Japan and Asia, but I'm afraid I'm not gonna have time.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Ching, for that super stimulating presentation. So I have a bunch of questions actually, but as you noticed in the chat, those of you who are watching the webinar today, feel free to use the Q&A function. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, and you could submit questions via that function, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. And if it seems like there's several students in the audience as well, so if, you guys should absolutely feel entitled to ask questions too. Don't be shy, please. So thank you so much, Leo, for that. I've lots of things to get into, and maybe one place to start would be just in terms of I mean, I really appreciated that very helpful chart that you gave in terms of comparing effectively what's going on with modernization theory on the one hand, and then also these kind of intranational developments in the context of the United States. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between, say, Asian studies and Asian American studies changing, or even if you kind of consider what's going on right now. I mean, I think one of the things that was helpful to think about was this kind of the way in which the model minority discourse, both in the United States, but then also, say, in Asia, is helping to drive a wedge between, or to kind of interrupt this kind of decolonial process that we see, particularly in Africa in the 50s after in the post-war period. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit more like how you see things developing, say, right now, particularly since I think with the events in Atlanta not long ago and the white supremacist violence in that context, a cry from and a kind of a call and if not demand on the part of Asian American, also Asian, but Asian American students in particular, to address some of these things and think about these structures and how maybe Asian studies departments, say, might be complicit in these kinds of structures. Right.
Thanks, Richie. Yeah, I obviously don't have time to and don't have the knowledge be able to sort of give you a comprehensive way of sort of seeing how the shift of our own discipline between Asian studies and Asian American studies. And obviously, I mean, these are, as I mentioned, two set of different priorities and has different history of institutionalization. Obviously, Asian studies existed prior to the 1940s or 1950s, before modernization theory even sort of existed, right? And, I mean, we don't need sort of Said's Orientalism to remind us there's a long history of fascination of European powers, American powers with Asia and beyond. And Asian American studies, however, has a very specific and this is well-known history of in solidarity with the Black movement in the 60s. As I mentioned, even the very phrase Asian American was I mean, it was imagined as a political identity rather than a kind of racial or ethnic identity. So now and which of course Asia is the same way, right? I mean, there's also this kind of amorphous. I mean, where does Asia begin? Where does Asia end? And the same when people are talking about how Asian American as a category, as not so much a political identity, but as a kind of sociological identity, actually conceals the differences. And so it's not as actually useful in terms of empirical analysis, right? So in that regard, I would like to differentiate, what I'm calling the political identity, which I think we can see this outside of United States, and in Asia we think about the Afro-Asian connections, the kind of thing that Vijay Prasad talks about, right? This kind of the darker nations, right? He talks about this idea of polyculturalism rather than multiculturalism, to think about, for example, the reception of Bruce Lee outside of Asia to Africa, to the Caribbeans. So there's all, and not to mention the Bandung Conference in 1955, even though the conference, I think, was more interesting as a symbolic get together rather than any kind of policy oriented achievement, right? So I think, so I think what's interesting is that the institutionalization of Asian studies and Asian American studies was very much separated and segregated, right? No, very few scholars. I think I can remember, for example, Arif Derlich and some Evelyn Hudahar, for example, has sort of critiqued this notion of the bridging between Americans or Asian Americans. And I think more specific, this was the 1980s context of Japanese Americans as bridging to Japan, as bridging this kind of relationship between US and Japan. So their critique is that we need to do away with this kind of sort of liberal sense of diversity and accommodation, and really launch a critique, an anti-imperialist critique, which I follow, as you can tell from the presentation. But however, I think now with the younger scholars in Asian American studies and the emphasis in Trans-Pacific, right, as a kind of analytic to think about American occupation in Asia. I'm sure there's something that Anne-Maria Shimabuku will talk about next week, about Okinawa, for example, and about American military base. And so there is this kind of, I think, growing focus that are troubling a very kind of benign sort of, the older area study model that, really based on a white heterosexual male. We're talking about Reischauer, Bella, and all those people who construct a kind of Japan as a kind of exceptional, right? That who these days can write a book called The Japanese? It's just inconceivable, but it was done. So I'm actually pretty excited about, so for example, from Asian studies, I guess Lisa Yoriyama's book work easily, right? The critique of Cold War, right? So Cold War, imperialism, and these are the kind of, I think, analytic which I see Asian Americans and Asian studies able to kind of have interesting conversation. I think, especially in relation to race, because I think Asian studies, we don't talk enough about race. I think that's where maybe some productive conversation can happen.
Yeah, no, indeed. We'll come back to that actually later in the Q&A, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you for that. So we have some questions that are appearing in the chat. So one is actually from Michael Yamada, which is actually a comment, but this might be interesting for your own research. Leo, he says, just a minor comment, as I lived in Indonesia for 4 years in the mid-1980s. Harimau is Malay as well as Indonesian. Matahari, meaning Eye of the Sun, is the same. Matahari was a Dutch female spy who led a mysterious and unfortunate life in Asia and Europe. I'm also curious about Prince Konoe, who assumed premiership 3 times prior to Tojo's, and Russian spy Richard Sorge. So there's other threads to follow up on. So I'm just going to leave that there. But thank you, Michael Yamada, for that question. We also have a question from Alison Alexi, who writes, quote, thank you for that really stimulating and energizing presentation. I'm wondering about reactions you've heard to the contrapuntal work you're doing. It seems that part of the project is to highlight connections between colonial projects and projects of domination that people might not otherwise see as connected. But I'm wondering if, say, your students are actually surprised by the connections when you highlight them, or do they see those connections coming? I ask because I've been struck that younger students now seem much quicker to understand, say, intersectionality. In this question, I'm asking about receptions you've noticed to the ideas you've presented today.
No, that's great. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what is interesting, I mean, on the one hand, the students are very, woke, right? I guess that's the word that we're using these days. So there are a lot of things that you don't even have to explain, right? I mean, it's sort of like Orientalism, like I don't know anybody who, in the last 10 years that actually read beyond the introduction, because they already know or think they know what Orientalism is, right? And also I think the media has picked it up, and and as you mentioned, intersectionality, the use of pronouns, and so on and so forth. I think there's definitely. However, I also find what's interesting is that because of their emphasis on presentness, and I'm sure Reggie, you will appreciate this, because they actually don't. They're surprised because none of them has, for example, watched Godzilla. They might have seen the American, the King of whatever, the 2000, I guess 2020, I can't remember, and there's so many of these.
King of Monsters or something like that.
Sure. Right. So even something like in the 50s is completely alien to them, right? And so they heard Godzilla, but Godzilla for them is just an adjective or a noun to express something that's huge, something that's big, something that's so they don't. So I think they appreciate the fact that that we can juxtapose these texts and generate interesting conversations, because what I find actually pedagogically, and I don't do this very successfully, but I strive to do it, is that students do not like to be told how to think, what to think. They don't want, especially they don't like, quote unquote, progressive faculty, who come in and basically lecturing them on, how to do things and how to understand, how to read. So what I try to do is bringing this kind of juxtaposition. So in a way, they have to read it themselves. Of course, I have an agenda, obviously, right? But the hope is that after they see those, even the clips side by side, you cannot not see the gendered and racialized relationship. And then when I move from there to MacArthur and Hirohito, then I think they see the connection, right? How well, how convincing that is. Again, doing culture studies, basically you allow the text, you allow the readers to kind of construct and construe meanings. So, but yeah, that's how I would put it. But yeah, thank you for that really good question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And this is another, maybe a quick follow-up related to that. This is from Harrison, our own Harrison Watson, who was asking basically about this for those of us in the audience who are trying to think about, how to teach this. And he says, how do you teach students how to recognize an opportunity to use contrapuntal reading? And it sounds like, you've juxtaposed in a very suggestive, subtle, and yet somehow ham-handed way, and so that they don't have a choice. But he also asks, have you observed any trends in how students react to encountering this technique as well?
So yeah, again, right? I think in the blurb, I put something down that contrapuntal requires some kind of imagination and luck, and I'm a firm believer in this encounter with text. That is sort of unpremeditated, right? Mm-hmm. That you read something, it becomes, so in a way, I always encourage students to read widely, right? So if you read just something about Japan, you're going to miss some possibility, for example. Mm-hmm. So I originally, actually, for this presentation, I had 4 case studies that I kind of wanted to share, but obviously that will take another 2 hours, and then it's probably
we'll have you back another time for the sequel.
Just kidding.
Right, yeah.
But one thing I also wanted to do is to juxtapose, to contrapuntally read these 2 texts. One from Japan is very interesting, and I think everybody should read. This is from Kojima Nobuo. It's called American School. I think 1954-ish, around the same time as Godzilla. And the other text I contrapuntally read is actually this short story from Taiwan by this author Huang Chunming called Sayonara Zaijian. Zaijian meaning in Chinese meaning goodbye, right? Just like sayonara. So what's interesting in both texts is that the American school is actually about this a group of American teachers, English teachers, Japanese English teachers that have to march from their school to visit the quote unquote American school and try to teach or learn how to teach English. And you have one character who's traumatized by his encounter with a Black soldier. So again, you have this kind of race thing. But what is really kind of fascinating there is the way language becomes this very violent, oppressive way of, so language in that regard is not just about communication, right? Language becomes an embodiment because Issa, the Japanese person who's traumatized the Black soldier, cannot even speak English, even though he's supposed to be an English teacher, because he's so traumatized that his body just refuses. And then you have Yamada, who actually wants to demonstrate to the Americans that he can actually be a better English teacher than the Americans. And he also talks about marching very much in the way of Japanese militarism, reminded him of Japanese imperialist endeavor in mainland China, right? So you have all these really interesting sort of colonial and American occupation thing together. And then we shift that to reading the Taiwanese short story, which is also about language, because in that story, a Taiwanese young person who was asked to entertain 6 Japanese salarymen who comes to Taiwan to basically for sex tourism. So they constantly, sort of demand from Taiwanese women and so on and so forth. So ultimately what this young man does that because he's fluent in Japanese, so he actually uses a language. But here, the language is no longer oppressive. Language becomes a way of shifting certain kind of consciousness and becomes a way of resisting a kind of Japanization of Taiwan, but also allows the Japanese to feel guilty about their own role, because all these men participated in the war against in China. So if I were reading simply 三日再见 in a Chinese language literature class, I would not be able to have the Chinese students or students in Chinese literature to see how the Japanese actually were also going under very similar experience of humiliation and so on and so forth, and vice versa with Japanese class as well. So again, I'm sort of trying to encourage this type of that readings that we usually don't associate as belonging together. So I guess that's just to use a very concrete example.
Thank you so much for that. So I have another question here. This is actually from Hua Ji-xin, Professor Hua Ji-xin, who's our Toyota visiting professor. Hi, Hua Ji.
Yes.
She says, thank you for a very interesting talk. In my experiences, my Gen Z students have no problem in embracing the idea of continuing legacy of racism and colonialism, but they often struggle to empirically prove this connection. What recommendations do you have for students who understand and embrace these ideas, but also want to demonstrate that legacy in more concrete ways in their work? Your table of juxtaposition is wonderful, but other ways do you think there are?
Wow, no, that's really difficult. I mean, this is what we as much as I hate assessment, because now we are bombarded with this demand for assessing. Because as I kind of like jokingly did in the beginning, this sort of learning objectives, right? But then of course, how do we know student can actually navigate, understand, and also concretely experience the kind of continued legacy of colonialism and so on and so forth. I don't think I'm in a better position than Professor Jin, because her work on Zainichi and so on and so forth, which in a way it's already concretized. So I probably need to think a little bit more, but in my own context, I actually find it's not so much that students don't make the connection. Once they make the connection, however, they still feel like this is not something that's going to affect me personally in my life, unless they belong to a particular community. right? So for example, maybe this is what I can talk about, and I think Reggie, this came out in our conversation earlier, is how do we think about the anti-Asian racism? So I have a lot of, Duke, 27% Asian American students, and or Pacific Island, whatever you want to call it. So, but it's quite substantial given the fact that when I first came to Duke in 1995, I think we had like 7%, right? So it's a huge jump. And then, because of what happened in Atlanta and elsewhere, there's a lot of this concern about. So we had webinars, we have conferences, everybody showing support, and so on and so forth, right? But there's this uncomfortable footage that demonstrate that all the perpetrators are not always white. They're, looks like African American as well, right? So then how do we talk about this sort of, problematic way of articulating, Asian American politics with, anti-Black racism, right? So this is where I suggest that we need to differentiate anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism. And again, this is not my original idea. This is something has been argued, especially most powerfully from Claire Jean Kim in her book. I'm blanking out. Well, anyways, I'll try to think about it. But the idea is that the Black experience is fundamentally different from the Asian experience, right? So what we need to be careful is not to end up playing up to the model minority myth that further distinguish or collapse sort of anti-Black racism with anti-Asian racism. They are not the same. There's no experience of Asian that can justify or that can compete with over 2 centuries of enslavement and continued sort of disposition and marginalization of the Black communities. So, and then we look at the way that Asian immigration pattern, takes place, and then we see there's actually substantial advantage that Asians, when we come to the United States versus the existing Black communities. And, again, we're not even talking about the indigenous population, right? So I think one way to think about the continuity of the kind of empire to the present is actually, again, through the critique of liberalism. White supremacists, actually, especially those, those Proud Boys or whatever, they just want to kill everybody. That they want to regain this. So it's actually very easy to deal with, right? As long as you either become Antifa, you fight them back with violence, or you just ignore them and live in places that they don't exist, and you try to, right? But the more difficult, I think, challenge is actually liberalism. The more difficult is the discourse of accommodation of diversity, that in a way creates this false chain of equivalency between minoritarian communities without historization. So for students to recognize that the continuity is not this kind of rupture from American racism to American multiculturalism, but there's actually a thread of liberalism that continues through that. So I apologize. I sort of went kind of all over the place.
No need to apologize at all. No, I think that's
so yeah. So hopefully that clarifies some of the. It's very kind of. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's why I don't go on Twitter. I cannot say things in 140.
That's your characters. No, that's fine. There's no need to apologize. I think about Lisa Lowe's work, The Intimacies of Four Continents, along those lines. Part of her argument there, right, is about just kind of how pervasive and pernicious, this discourse of liberalism is, liberal humanism, but, as related to, systemic exploitation, slave trade, et cetera, genocide of indigenous populations, et cetera. And I think that's a harder thing for students to grasp. I think particularly, just to kind of follow up before going to some other questions, the multicultural universities, kind of corporate multiculturalism, that's so much a part of even the notion of DEI initiatives often, right, is so baked in to a certain kind of liberal progressive notion of what it means to be fair or just or better than, say, if we're talking about Proud Boys or just kind of rampant white supremacists, right? And I think that people kind of recognize that as very clearly a better way to proceed, but aren't really able or kind of equipped to historicize that in terms of some of these kind of histories that you're pointing out with this model minority discourse being used as a wedge. So it's one thing to talk about model minorities, it's another thing to talk about redlining and
Right.
why these communities that are marginalized in different ways, but are in such close proximity, for instance. So I think that's another vote in favor of some of the work that you're doing. It's really useful to think about. So Hua Ji says, great response and much appreciated. So you have not disappointed her, yeah, which is good. So we have a question now from Jessica Fernandez de la Harada from the UK, who says, thank you for your talk. Can you please tell us a bit more about what the transfigurations in area studies, Asian American studies, and trans-Pacific studies reflect and produce in terms of theoretical, methodological, but also wider geopolitical concerns? And if there's time, she says, I wonder about how we can apply the contrapuntal reading that you propose to center the experiences of people often obscured by a focus on the role of the US and Japanese states. And so maybe
take the second part.
is a way to think about that. But yeah.
But I mean, I think that is really the difficult question, right? Because how do you write or narrate history that has been either marginalized or invisible for the longest time? I always remember something like, when Stuart Hall, the cultural studies critic, talk about how he discovered sort of Jamaicanness or Blackness in London, right? In other words, because he is sort of from a middle class sort of background in Jamaica, and he's sort of light-skinned, right? So the question is, I mean, so in a way, it requires certain kind of contrapuntal in the sense that the reinsertion of the previously marginalized or the colonized into the metropolitan, right? To disrupt, not simply become a kind of multicultural discourse, right? But then by bringing that, I mean, something that my colleague Walter Mignolo calls the colonial difference, right? That's something that's not the same, something that irritates, something that transgresses, something that makes one uncomfortable. And that's very hard to do because I mean, how then do we do that when, as Said says in the Contrapuntal Reading, when he talks about the Mansfield Park, right? He talks about, there's references to Antigua. But then, I mean, Jane Austen obviously is not going to write about Antigua because she cannot, at her historical condition, be an anti-racist or anti-imperialist. That'd be shocking. Right, so it is our job as scholars, as students, to fill in the blanks, right? To enable certain type of narrative to come not as a kind of simply as a substitute, because I think what is useful about Said is that these are interwoven, these are interdependent narratives, right? We cannot simply separate the metropolitan from the colonial stories. And even within the metropolitan, there are other narratives, right? Women, I mean, people talk, I mean, and then there are the workers, of course. And in the colonies, of course, then there are the colonial women who occupy very different, and Stoller's work talks about this, right? How is, their precarious position in between the colonizer and the colonized, right? So you have a lot of these kind of, I guess, messiness that are built into the sort of colonial enterprise. And if anything, I think post-colonial theory, especially that of Homi Bhabha, really helped us to think about is that the colonial discourse is not something, sort of complete, right? It's not something that it's secure, that's stable. It constantly sort of creates a slippage, right? So again, when we think about how to bring the colonial back into the metropolitan, or some people call it writing back, right? To write back. I think this is the Australian model, writing, the Empire Writes Back. I think that's the edition, right? The edited volume. I mean, it's very difficult. I don't think there's any sort of guaranteed method. And I'm personally, I don't subscribe into a particular type of theoretical model. I basically use whatever that is available to me and try to think about it. So, and this is where I think, I put in the title imagination. I really think, it requires us to get out of our disciplinary box, So, and I get this actually from the late Marion Silverberg, a very it's an awesome person, but a tremendous scholar of Japan, right? I mean, she once said, right, I mean, what you need is imagination. And I was thinking, this is a historian telling me, the literary critic, that we need imagination. I'm like, how wonderful is that? So I don't know if I have again a coherent response, but so I'll just leave it there.
Well, I mean, if you come down on the side of imagination in relation to these kind of empiricist concerns, I think that's really important, right? So we have time for a couple more. There's one from another student. This is from Lola Yang. Hi, Lola. Thank you for the compelling, insightful presentation. I'm a student and I was wondering, when thinking about anti-Asian racism or any forms of oppression in a white dominant, heterosexist, patriarchal society, how do we understand such structural violence without claiming victimhood?
Yeah, very, very good question, right? I mean, I think this is where the issue of identity politics could become both a potential of transformative move, but also a limitation. I think, again, it's not to imagine that there is this kind of pathway, this unmediated, unimpeded pathway to salvation or liberation, right? These things take zigzag and takes tremendous amount of commitment from different people, right? And I think it really, I mean, what you said is really important about not simply be mired as simply being a victim, or politicize victimization as the only way to demand recognition, right? This is what usually happens in a liberal society, right? The politics of recognition, right? You said exactly that you have to. I need to be recognized through my own experience of victimhood, which I think is one aspect, right? But at the same time, if we recognize the limitation of that and how that itself can actually produce, sort of oppressions and create other victims, then I think we are, be more, I guess, self-reflexive about the way that politics are being mobilized. I don't think it's impossible to have politics without certain type of investment, right? So this is either through identity or through emotion or through some kind of empathy, right? I cannot imagine politics without emotion. I mean, it's not possible. But at the same time, right, we need to also recognize the limit of how that takes us, right? This is where I will insist theory, philosophy, knowledge is important and is essential. In other words, we cannot have politics simply based on certain kind of convictions without learning and reading and so on. And then again, it does not have to be books, right? This does not have to be like, I mean, it could be oral story, it could be things told by elders, right? I mean, I don't mean to codify this into simply something scholarly or academic. Right. So for me, I mean, one of my favorite phrase from Antonio Gramsci is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? Intellectualization always bring us to this kind of, oh my God, what can I do, right? Everything is just so bad. I mean, things are so terrible. The more I study, the more I learn, the more I listen to people, the situation seems just untenable. So there is a kind of certain kind of pessimism. But then we know in human history that people always step forward, because not so much because they're pessimistic, because they believe that certain change is possible. And they continue, right? We look at the civil rights movement. We look at, this kind of, even in Zainichi movement, right? There's all kinds of difficulties still, right? But people keep doing it. So I think we need a combination of the two, right? Both the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will.
Thank you for that. And I'm struck, first of all, by I think the usefulness of your kind of guerrilla tactics in terms of drawing from as many different types of methods and traditions as possible to kind of get that interpretive job, if not political job done. I think that's a really good example. I mean, you've joked before about being kind of undisciplined in these ways that I think that actually adds a richness to what you're doing. And I was struck too by what you were saying in relation to Lola's question, with regard to things like the kind of Harvard case and the around affirmative action, and to what extent are Asian American students being discriminated against, and which is to say that this notion of a different kind of victimhood that's very much playing into the, sponsored by financially, but then also playing into the hands of a certain kind of let's just call it a kind of racist agenda as it relates to rolling back certain protections or different kind of politics, right, under the banner of a certain kind of grievance. And I also wanted to mention Anne Chang's work along these lines. I think she's been really useful in my thinking and thinking about different issues and how grievance is really insufficient at a certain level, and thinking about these different ideas. So we're just about at time. I realize that there are some other questions, and Leo will send these questions to you. And I would encourage people who might have questions either that have been put in the chat that haven't been addressed. Leo's very generously offered to share some of the materials, but I think it's also fair to say, if you'd like to write him directly to continue the conversation, you should do that. And feel free also to let your friends and colleagues know about this lecture, which will be on our CJS YouTube site in the coming days. And with that, I'd just like to thank you. This first, again, of many conversations. Professor Ching's podcast interview will also be up in the coming weeks as we edit and clean that up as well. So please check that out. Lots of really interesting things about his own background, in addition to his intellectual formation, which I think has been really fascinating. We can all learn a lot from. So you can check out those links in the chat again if you haven't seen them already. So with that, we're at time. So please join me in thanking Professor Leo Ching for a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Leo.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Reggie.
Yeah,
when you write to me, just say you're a friend of Reggie, then I'll definitely respond.
Right, that's very kind. Yeah. Please don't write that.
but I do welcome inquiries and comments, and yeah. So lching@duke.edu. So yeah, feel free to. And thank you all for the wonderful questions and for coming on. It's Friday lunchtime or breakfast time or dinner time, depending where you are. But thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining.